Well,
Yeah.
it's interesting, like in the marketplace, I would say the thing you're hired for mostly is your craft and how
Yeah.
well you do your craft. You come into the ministry space and it is all about relationship first, and
Yeah.
then your craft really comes second. And so this is where I think many people struggle coming from the marketplace into I did, where I came in, I was like, what's my 20 deliverables that you want me to do this month? And they were like, have a good marriage and like get to know us. And I was like, oh, okay, like,
That's
man,
all.
this is
That's
really,
weird.
and then even like, if I pour all my craft, right? Like, okay, I'm going to fashion this incredible financial strategy. It's a 5-year projection with like, blah, blah, and I've done all that stuff. And then, ministry leaders look at that. They're like, okay, cool. Like, we're just trying to make it to Sunday. So
Yeah.
literally don't care. But, not in a
Yeah.
mean way, but okay, cool. That's cute that you did. Does this mean we get to spend money or no? And you're like, oh, this is so frustrating. Like, man, like, why
Yes.
can't you consume all my craft? And so I
Yeah.
think one of the biggest things is for those marketplace folks to recognize, like, man, how can I still
Mhm.
relish the gifts that God has given me, right, in terms of how I apply my craft, but recognize that I get to sow more deeply into relationship than maybe I've ever been able to do so before. And in fact, the more that I do that, the more it leads to
Yeah.
what? Openness to my craft, right? And
Craft, right?
so, but
Mhm.
many people struggle because they want to put the craft first and
Yep.
think that's going to impress a pastor when in reality they're going to be
Yeah.
cool.
What you just heard is a snippet of today's podcast, and I am so excited to introduce to you John Hughes. He is a Biola University graduate, and out of college, he was able to join one of the big 4 accounting firms. He took all the knowledge and information he learned in the industry, and he's now applying it to the nonprofit and church space. He has a heart for the local church. John has a heart for your church. And today we're going to be talking about what does it look like to be financially healthy in 2021, and how can we figure out and navigate PPP in the loan forgiveness process. This is going to be a great podcast for you. And if you enjoy the Kingdom One podcast, would you do us a favor? Go over to Apple Podcasts and give us a review and a rating so other ministry leaders can find this podcast just like you. Let's jump into today's episode.
Welcome to the Kingdom One podcast, where we grow the church together. This podcast is here to give you big ideas and help you get practical with the tactical. Here's your host, Nick Ovalle.
Hey, Kingdom One family, thanks for stopping by for another podcast. Today we have John Hughes, Steve Bush, our CEO, and we're going to talk about how to be financially healthy as a church in this new year. So, John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here with you guys.
Stephen, great to see you again.
Great to be with you as well, Nick.
So, John, can you talk to our audience a bit and just tell them, where you come from, what you do, and why your expertise is really important in this conversation?
Sure. So I live here in Southern California, just north of LA, tucked between Santa Barbara and Los Angeles and Ventura, California. My family and I live here. We've been here for about 6 years. This is where I grew up. So my roots are in this town right here on the coast. But I've spent the majority of my time over the last several years in Orange County after I finished school at Biola, and then moved to the Central Valley and Fresno, and then here. So my background is in public accounting, or I started in public accounting about now 16 years ago. I'm a certified public accountant. In those years, I specialized in not-for-profit organizations and audits of those organizations, specifically higher education and other not-for-profits. So church-related ministries, health and human services type organizations, and then schools, colleges and universities. But around the time of the Great Recession, had the opportunity to jump and go chase after my dream job, and went and worked at Hume Lake Christian Campus up outside of Fresno for 6 years, ultimately assuming the role of chief financial officer there, and had a wonderful experience, and went through a lot of interesting challenges during those times. But it was a phenomenal learning experience for myself and for my family, and yet continued to feed that passion for ministry and ministry finance. And so upon coming back here to Ventura, moved out of the ministry world for this season, which has enabled our family to do some other things and invest in our health and raising our kids, but still have my foot in the door with ministries. And I help local churches in this area and parachurch ministries in the area of finance, really the effort is to come alongside them and relieve them of some of the burdens of responsibility of financial management, financial leadership, so that they can focus in on shepherding the church, doing what they do best, bring that expertise to the table to them. And, it's not easy for a church, smaller churches especially, to have access to some of that knowledge and experience. And so I want to take what God's given me and how he's resourced me with my passions and give back to the church in that way, and support them. And it's a tough world. Church finance, ministry finance, I think, poses some of the more challenging topics, challenging tax issues that face organizations, for profit and not for profit. And there's just not a lot of CPAs that go into that field explicitly. And so having that background, I think, has kind of put me in a unique spot to serve the kingdom in that way.
That is so awesome. What I heard you say was, there has to be a lot of intentionality when it comes to, how we set up our finances as a church, the tax laws. There are some things that are very difficult for churches and for nonprofits. Can we talk about that? This past year has probably been very, very difficult for a lot of churches and ministry leaders. Can we talk about just that financial disruption? What has that financial disruption been? And Stephen, maybe you could speak a bit to this too, is in your role as well. How can we be financially healthy going into this new year?
I think the challenges that ministry have faced are not unique just to ministries and churches. I think companies and organizations as a whole have all wrestled with a shaking of their foundation. I mean, all of us we're in Southern California, Steve and I, and so we're not unfamiliar with with earthquakes, and this has been an earthquake in our economy in a lot of senses, and all sides of it. And so, if there's been any crack in any foundation of any organization, I think it has amplified, it has grown, and so any issues that haven't been dealt with, again, have been magnified. And unfortunately, there's a financial implication to everything that occurs in an organization, and ministry is no exception. And so, as those cracks have shown, it has had financial impact. And so I think the churches that have struggled with, maybe have been wrestling for the last several years with certain maybe ministry opportunities or investment into certain programs, have probably felt the financial impact of some of those things maybe falling off. I think of the parachurch ministries, especially coming out of camping. I mean, they are hurting real bad because they are not able to host camps, especially in California, where our restrictions have been the tightest. They're looking for other means of income. They've had to pivot significantly on their business models, their ministry models, to continue to do what they do, to really feed the economic engine of the ministry. I mean, that's the other way to think about it, is what is the economic engine that supports all of these programs and these ministries? And so whether it's a church, and the attendance typically drives that economic engine, when their churches have not been able to gather, how has the church engaged with its people, continued to shepherd at a distance through technology, and just not that physical presence? I think that's had that has been the lead indicator of the financial challenges. And so tightening up budgets, going after federal funding, relooking at ministry models to be lean, but focusing on what's most important. I think there's, I'm going to botch who said, but you never want to miss an opportunity in good crisis. And there's been a lot of opportunity, though, at the same time, for churches and ministries to reevaluate what they do, what they're doing, how to get back maybe to the core, again, economic engine or business or mission goal, and make sure that's healthy so as to continue on in the future.
Yeah, you touched on something that I'd like to maybe press into a bit, and you talked about camps, specifically Christian camps, and how they're going to have to make some pivots. Can you maybe speak to that ministry leader and tell them what do those pivots need to be, specifically in Southern California, because I know lockdown is really, really tight where you guys are.
I think first and foremost, we're praying for them. I mean, my heart hurts for the decisions that they're having to make. I think camps are shuttering their doors across the country. It is generally a lean operation as it goes. The financial burdens on camp are so challenging because of the infrastructure that has to be supported, facilities, facility maintenance, and then you throw the fact that most of our camps are in the mountains and all the elements and fires come their way. It just makes just normally and normal, the normal business constraints, especially in California, make it already challenging enough, and then add this into the mix. I think that as best we can, we need to continue to pray for those ministry partners, because there's such a key role that camp plays in, I think, the function of the church, especially those ministries that come alongside the church. So that being said, I think that practically for those leading those camps is to focus in on what they do best. What is the bread and butter of that ministry? And they're not all the same. My experience, obviously, at Hume Lake is they are rooted in youth camps. Stay in the youth camping space. If it's adult camps, hone in on adults. This is not necessarily a season to look at new things or things that could be what is referred to as mission creep, but to go back to the core thing that has allowed the ministry to continue thus far. Looking at the partnerships that are already in place, whether it's with donors or churches, continue to go back to those partners, those ministry partners, and connect with them to reinforce relationships, ask how they can help the local church. Because at the core of this, we can't forget that it is the local church. It is the church that is feeding the parachurch ministry. And so as the parachurch and the outside ministries can go back to the core and connect with those ministry leaders at the churches, I think it's going to help them strengthen those partnerships and relationships for the long term. It's been amazing to see how of the camps that I have connections with, just how their ministry partners, their donors have really stepped up. I mean, the millions of dollars that are being contributed to churches, to ministries, to camps is mind-boggling right now, and it's amazing to see the generosity of those ministry partners and people to see those places continue to keep going.
That's awesome. Yeah, definitely. We'll be praying for those parachurch ministries, those camps, and those leaders. Yeah, thank you for that and that wisdom, just the bread and butter, really hone in on what you do and focus on that. Yeah. That's such great advice. Stephen,
it's easy to get distracted.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. You see that shiny new thing and you just want to chase after it. And I think in this season, it's just really good to focus on the basics, the ones and the twos. So, Stephen, how has 2020 disrupted church? I mean, you have firsthand experience with this in your role and in everything that you do. Can you speak to that side of it?
Sure. And as I speak to that, there's kind of two spaces that I share kind of these thoughts. One is, as many of you know, I have the privilege of serving at my local church as their business administrator, their sort of CFO, if you will. But then also in our work at Kingdom One, I interact with a lot of churches and have these kind of conversations. And so what I would say is that I think this season has put a tremendous amount of pressure on churches when it comes to the financial front. I think, John, you would probably agree with me. Finance, almost kind of like HR, and maybe some of the other shared services functions, they're kind of like necessary evils in the church space. I mean, to some degree, I think pastors would almost prefer if they didn't necessarily need all these different components, but they do. And again, they're very appreciative. So I'm not by any means knocking, you church finance folks or pastors that work with them. But I think there's been a tremendous amount of pressure, right? Our budgets have been kind of questioned of should we be spending money? Should we be hoarding dollars as much as we can? How do we forecast? All of our sort of rhythms have been disrupted. As John mentioned, a lot of them are driven by attendance and where you land on the spectrum as a church of, hey, we're going to be open because, we're supposed to be, or, hey, we want to make sure that we're protecting people, keeping them safe, et cetera. And so we're going to, shift to really being online. It's caused a lot of just major question marks for ministries to wonder, what should we do financially? What should we be investing in? Because there's kind of this new era of ministry really that's being born. Many churches didn't even have much of an online presence, and now they're finding maybe that's something that we should be more intentional with, but that also comes with a cost. And so should we be spending money in that because we believe in a few months we won't need it anymore? And so again, it's caused a lot of these really big questions. And what I would hope that if you are a CFO or a business administrator within a church, My hope for you is that you have invested a lot of time building relational equity with your leadership, with your pastors. I know for me personally, at the church that I work at, this has been a year where 5 years worth of relational equity being invested in has enabled me to be able to say, hey guys, I think we need to shore up our spending, but I want to create a plan and a framework for you to be able to operate and do it nimbly without feeling like everything has to go through me, right? And so that comes to kind of a budget construct, that comes to some financial strategies, laying out like, hey, here's some scenarios of what could happen. Here's our markers to tell us when we might need to pivot or shift or whatever. And but at the bottom end of all of that, or the most important kind of common denominator in that, really goes back to relationship. It goes back to not just kind of pointing a bunch of financial documents to a pastor and saying, see, you're not allowed to spend all that dumb stuff that I didn't think you should have spent money on anyway. It really goes into like, okay, how do I sort of chart a financial course for you? But it's this collaborative interaction, this collaborative process, together to hopefully be able to influence the ship a little bit, to say, hey, yeah, we probably should reduce spending. We probably should be conscious about building a little bit more of a cash reserve, those types of things. But all that to say, a whole lot of pressure. But I think through that, as John said, there's this opportunity really that has emerged of, man, can we forge even closer bonds together where there's a sense of like, man, I'm really grateful as a pastor that I've got not just hopefully a pretty decent financial mind on my staff, but also like somebody that gets ministry, that understands what we're trying to do and is with us, not kind of like against us. And we're battling now as we try to make our way through COVID.
I think, Steve, your point is, I can't emphasize how on point that is, the relational component, because it's now when the seeds of those investment are fruiting and growing. And to be able, for a finance and business leader especially, to have taken the time to get into the ministry worlds of the various ministry leaders, to understand their challenges, to sit aside them as they do ministry, take off your finance hat, put yourself in their role. It doesn't mean you have to go out and do the work, but just to at least have lived it a little bit is going to pay so many dividends in those relationships. Because then when you can sit across the table and say, hey, I know this is hard, but we got to cut spending in your ministry area, they're going to know that you understand that ministry area. They're going to know that you feel it too, because you've lived it. And I think at any point, if and it's obviously it's a little hard to suggest it now, but if you're a ministry leader that hasn't done that, there's no time like the present to do it. Get into their worlds, roll up your sleeves, understand their pain points, sit and don't have them try and understand your world. Try and understand their world. And I think then that draws the relationship closer. So when that difficult conversation can happen, it's just so much easier. And I think to kind of round it out, our jobs is not to, I hate being the decider. I don't like being the one that is at the end of the day, the people are coming to me, ask for money. It's like, no, I want to give people the opportunity. I want to give ministry leaders the understanding and the ability to spend within boundaries. I think our roles have been to create the sandbox for which ministry leaders can play in. And we just want to make sure that they're staying in the sandbox and the toys aren't flying outside.
That's right.
Keep the sand in and then come alongside them and bring them back and help them to see and make decisions wisely, because they're the ones that are making the ministry's decisions every day, who to go have coffee with, what programs to invest in. That's not us. We're there to help coach and guide them and consult them on how to make decisions well, using the financial tools we have available to us and how we see the world. But anyways, I think to spend time as business leaders to understand what the ministry leaders are going through is just, it pays in the hard seasons. It pays so many dividends. I've seen it. I've experienced it and am reminded of that constantly. And some of my closest friends we sat across the table. They're the ministry leaders. I'm the business leader. And we kind of fought and we had to argue, but that's not a bad thing. That's good conflict. That's the refining fire. That's the stuff that helps us polish the stones to get through and challenge each other well, but to keep it all in balance so that we can move forward, not kill the ministry from a lack of finances, but also not, micromanage it into the ground. So
That's right.
anyways,
And it's hard
I couldn't agree
sometimes,
more.
John. I don't know if you've experienced it, but it's hard sometimes because you might look at certain things that dollars are being spent on, and you're like, man, that just doesn't make a ton of sense to me. And even if you
Yeah.
do get into the trenches a little bit, and I totally agree with you, I think, if you're in a shared services role, especially if your church has some kind of like, hey, we'll give you some time to, go to camp, or we'll give you some time to, whatever, or certainly, make sure you're still volunteering within your church. Just because you're on a church staff doesn't bar you from serving, right? But if you're not getting to experience different facets of ministry, it's really, at the end of the day, not our job to pass judgment on necessarily, what is being spent. And I like what you said. I like creating a financial framework
Yeah.
where there's a lot of freedom.
Mhm.
It's a lot of like, cool, I don't have to come to your door every day to say, hey, can I spend another $100 on this? Or, hey, can I
Yeah.
spend another $25 on that? And even some churches we work with, that maybe are a little bit more, perhaps kind of elder driven, that's sometimes the reality is like, man, I got to ask for all kinds of things. But I think, as a financial leader, as a shared services person within your church or ministry, building that relationship, kind of through the lens of even that financial framework pays tremendous dividends to be able to, as you said, kind of have to make hard calls and pull in the reins without having to lose a ton of chips, right? Where it's more like, okay, I know that you get what we're trying to do and you're on board with our mission. And this plan is going to help us accomplish that. And I trust you, right? And that's the fruit of good, deep relationship is trust.
Well, and at the same time, I think for an accountant, where our world is so data driven and so numbers oriented, when encountering a ministry leader and they're wanting to continue to do something, it stretches my faith too, and
Yeah.
having to trust in the Lord. Like I've been given a gift of numbers and administrations and accounting and all that stuff. And so I know the answer in my head. I have all this training to tell me what A, B, and C equal D. So therefore we should do that. But when someone says, no, we're going to continue to do this in faith. Okay, Lord, increase my faith, and so there's an element of that relationship. Then we can go to the pastoral staff or to the ministry leaders and say, okay, will you even to pray for over my faith, that I can trust the Lord in that way. And so there's spiritual growth that happens in our world too. I have that day in my head where I was confronted with that, and it sticks in my mind. And I was probably in the wrong. So I should have had more faith. We'll say that.
Yeah. I've been lovingly called before at my church the no faith department, the finance department. And you're right, it's hard. It's how do you balance sort of forecasting and faith, and what is the faith factor, and all those different types of things. But again, as you develop that relationship over time, you're able to at the same time be a good advocate for stewardship, for wisdom when it comes to how monies are spent. And honestly, I think that there are a lot of really cool budgeting, forecasting, financial tools that enable a ministry to be able to act in faith, but do it from a position of, hey, we've got dollars in the bank that we can do the faith investment type things in, right? When it comes to our operational budget, we're going to make that a little bit more based on kind of the hard data, like you're referencing, sort of trends and analysis, those types of things. But yes, that is always kind of that wild card in any conversation where there's like, hey man, I prayed last night and I think God told me we should spend $1 million. And you're like, oh wow, okay. Well, man,
he didn't appear to me.
Yeah, that's right.
But at the same time, we get to remind these ministry leaders of Joseph in the storehouse and filling the storehouses for Egypt. And so one of my clients right now is in a very similar situation where, we haven't quite seen the need to tap the storehouse yet, but we haven't had a specific, I think this is the application, is if there isn't a specific calling on the church to do a specific ministry and there's resources for it, don't do it.
Yeah.
Because we don't know what's coming. And the principles of saving and reserves are so important. And then at the same time, it is a balance. It's how to then deploy those assets appropriately to get the kingdom work going. And you can get, I've had some challenging conversations around the concept of endowments and when are endowments appropriate, having a long-term perspective. But yes, hell is hot and time is short. So, but we want to be good stewards like Joseph. Anyway, so there's just there's some tough balances in there.
Yeah.
But when those financial disciplines are put in place, and I think that's where we can come in with that love and care and relational side, is encourage good disciplines, good financial stewardship, so that when the day of COVID-19 or whatever next is going to happen, we can continue to do ministry and not only care for the flock really well, but care for the shepherd, the under shepherds well too, the pastoral staff, and they're stretched. Anybody who touches finance or is leading an organization right now is probably overdone. And so how do we continue to bless them or nourish their souls, invest in them, give them what they need in this season? And those stewardship practices enable the ministry to do that.
Amen.
Yeah, I can see that book behind you, John. It's The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni. And that is such a great book because it talks about how, you don't need to have silos within organizations.
Yes.
And one thing we say at Kingdom One is we fight fair. And sometimes you just have to bring to light your perspective because, not everybody sees your perspective. So I think that's so good, that fighting fair and just having great conflict is just a way for all of us to get better and keeping it healthy. My next question for you guys is around PPP and loan forgiveness. Can you maybe walk through PPP, what are some of those loan forgiveness things that we need to do as an organization and maybe help our audience understand that a bit more?
Well, that game keeps changing and that has been complicated. There's a key delineation of how you walk through that process. If you've got a loan over $2 million or under $2 million. And if you're a ministry that's under $2 million, it's going to be a whole lot easier than if it's over $2 million. And if you've got a loan that's over $2 million, you probably are well resourced and you're handling this pretty well because that means there's a lot of payroll costs and you probably have somebody like us on your staff already. But on the underside, I think the first thing there's been a lot that I think ministries have learned because of this process. And if you've gone through that loan application process and now you're in the forgiveness process, and this isn't a complete, it doesn't apply to every situation, but you either now love your bank or you hate your bank. It's probably or you're looking for a new bank. Because it was really hard for a lot of ministries to bank with, some of the major national banks and they couldn't get access to the systems. They couldn't go through the process. If a ministry was working with a local bank, they may have been first in line. They may have had their application in on April, I think it was 14th, no, 8th. Anyways, right there at the beginning. And they walked alongside you in that process. They were there for you in that process. And there were a lot of banks that just said, we're not going to do this. And that's unfortunate. And then that forced the ministry to go out and find a different bank to work with. And so I think as we talk about relationships within the organization, I think relationships outside the organization have been incredibly critical in the PPP process. And that's important because we have to recognize that the bank, if you're going through the forgiveness process, the bank is on your side. Don't fear going to them and working with them on the application of forgiveness because they don't want those things as much as you don't want them. If anybody spent any time in the banking industry, they'll know that a 1% loan won't even cover the cost of the bank. So if the bank has to carry these debt obligations for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, they're going to lose money on it. So they're going to do everything they can to come alongside the ministry to help get that loan forgiven in front of the SBA. That's a very important point. I think that is the bank is on your side. Sole ministry leader, minimal background in this world. I would not hesitate to go get some help, have somebody help you with this process. There's a lot of every CPA out there that's in public accounting has gotten their feet in this world. I found myself in 4 or 5 of these processes. Many of them, a lot of them aren't even my clients, but we're willing to help because I think there's a kingdom perspective that goes along with this that we all want to help with. But you want to be very careful to provide the data that's necessary to get to the end goal. My advice is provide what's needed. Be careful to provide more than what's needed, but be very explicit of the information that's needed, very explicit and give the detail necessary to get from point A to point B, which is the total forgiveness. And I spent my years as in public accounting as an auditor. And so for me, what I'm always thinking about is who is going to be looking at this work that I'm putting together? Who's going to look at the supporting documentation to go along with the application? And how can I get them from point A to point B to point C, all of the totals up to the next page, up to the next page, to the ultimate application as simple as possible?
Mm-hmm.
It could be as simple as putting A with a circle around it to page 4. And then you have A from page 4 at the next number. And so it's like a puzzle. And so if you can make that puzzle very easy for somebody to follow, it's going to be really easy to get through forgiveness. And I think ministries have had be careful how I say this, they've had a very easy time. It hasn't been as onerous as some. I think that there have been some questions maybe that have come back from the SBA, but that all filters through the bank. And so that's where the bank partnership is really important, because they're on your side. They should be looking at this stuff with you before it goes to the SBA, ultimately then to get forgiveness. So those are some of those, I think, key points and things that I've observed in the forgiveness process. Now, we also have PPP2 on the doorstep that maybe churches and ministries are going to be looking at. That's a whole nother set of issues and challenges. But it's, this thing since day one has been evolving feels like every 4 to 6 weeks. When I share with people, especially back in June and May and April, and what's this like? I'd always show the meme of the little girl going, I don't know. And I think I don't know what's happening. I mean, I've got one loan that I'm working through right now. The SBA was supposed to have forgiven back in November, and they haven't yet. And I'm really glad they haven't, because of all the changes that came in the recent legislation. So there's just a lot of unknowns. So anyways, I think those are some key things. You can do it. It's not impossible. And again, your bank is on your side.
Just to tag into that, I think, John, your advice is really, really good. I know, having personally done a PPP loan for the local church that I get to work with, a few things that stood out to me. One, and I totally agree, was keep your documentation as clean as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine if you, who are listening to this or watching this, had a stack of these things on your desk and you had to literally go through all of these. Would you get to yours, now that you've submitted, and just be like, oh my gosh, what do these people do? Like, let me go to something else that's easier. Like, let me grab the next stack. Like, you want to be the one in the stack that they're like, oh my gosh, this is so clear. This is so easy to understand.
Yes.
I love it. Boom. I feel good about, this particular application. Right. And so you want to be able to be helpful to the person that's having to look through all this. And again, as we talked about earlier, relationship, right? So if you have not put that relational equity into building, that bridge with your financial institution, I mean, hopefully you've done that and you're getting dividends from the relationship you have with that banker. If not, I mean, get it going now, right? So start investing that time, that energy. And remember, gosh, we're ministries. And so of all of the clients that a bank has, why can't we be the best?
Yeah.
Why can't we be the ones that aren't not just like, hey, how come this hasn't been approved yet? Or, hey, what's the timeline? And we're kind of cranky about it. How can we be a blessing to the banker on the other end of the phone to say, man, thank you so much for the work that you like. I can't tell you how much this means to us that you would give me just even 5 minutes of your time today, right? Like, let's be the church even to these bankers, right? But a few other quick things that I would say as well. For our loan, we started with our local bank, and then our local bank actually sold our PPP loan to kind of this consolidator bank, if you will. And so at first it was like, oh, I'm dealing with this person, and now there's a whole different person and a whole different portal, a whole different system that I have to navigate. And this is, again, where having really clean documentation, I think, is really, really paramount. Also remember too, as John said, this changed so many times. I felt like I had to keep relearning the rules. One of the key ones, though, that I think was really important is that the time frame of when you could use the funds got extended, right? So remember, you got a 2.5 month essentially loan for 2 months worth of time. What do you do with that other half month? Well, that was supposed to be used for leases, for interest, for kind of utilities, all these different types of things. One of the things, and John, you can push back if you think I'm off base, but this loan was really designed to support payroll, right? I mean, and there was percentages that were established of like, hey, this has to go for X amount of payroll. If you don't, it's not going to be forgiven. What we ended up doing is we had started documentation on all of the kind of ancillary stuff that you could use those funds on. We ended up just getting rid of all of that because the time frame got extended. Make it all payroll. It's really simple. That makes the stack of papers. Now you're not showing, here's our bills from, all of our power bill and our, et cetera. Just make it payroll. It's supposed to be supporting people anyway. And so that consolidates the amount of stuff that you're turning in. And that, in my opinion, greatly enhances the possibility of it getting approved in terms of being converted into a grant. And I was just telling John before we started recording, ours at my local church just got approved. And so I think, we've done all that well. I know, a round of applause. It's super exciting. And so, to see that payoff note was really, really great. And honestly, the process was not that difficult because all the way at the beginning, we kept our documentation really clean. It allowed our interaction with the bank to be really straightforward, and it allowed that conversion, to a grant to just go that much faster.
Yeah, and I'd echo that. We had a couple of the loan forgivenesses that I went through in the 8-week period. I would have had to pull in some of the occupancy expenses, but we kicked it out. And it wasn't just you go 8 weeks or 24 weeks. You could go to 10 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever was necessary, up to 24 weeks to grab payroll. And I completely agree. It's the path of least resistance conversation. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. If you're already at this point and you're working on your application, you've already got all the weeks done. That has happened. So I would go all payroll. And if you remember back where we were in April when this was all starting to roll out, one way to think about it, and the way I would explain it, is that this was really the PPP loan was intended to eliminate the bureaucracy around the workers, the unemployment office.
That's right.
It took for people to get unemployment, and still to this day to claim unemployment is quite long and exhaustive. And so if from a federal government standpoint, if they could keep anybody out of the unemployment line, the better. And to use the dollars for that purpose was its natural intent. And it worked in a lot of places. It worked for the organizations I am a part of. It cost a little bit, but again, it was worth it in the long run. So I think that, and at the same time, the threshold was dropped from 75% on payroll down to 60% on payroll. So it made it even, again, on payroll. Yeah. So it just made it all the more easier. Now, one of the other interesting things is that we found that not all banks gave out 2.5 times of that 2 months of salary. So your bank may have chosen to do something a little bit different there and has issued less. If that's the case, know that that's the bank protecting themselves. They have a lot of exposure in this process, especially the small community banks. So you might, again, there's just a lot of things that have been learned through this process, and having that open dialogue with the people that you're working with can help, help you understand maybe why the bank made the decisions they made. And I encountered one of those, and I was at first a little bit disappointed that we missed out on 0.5 of the loan value. But when I understood why the bank made that decision, it gave me more confidence in them as an organization, as a bank in the long run. I don't want to see them go under. So anyways,
and I would say to Nick, if you're listening to this and you're a pastor at your church, maybe you don't even have a business administrator or an office manager, and you're like, I just need help, man. I'm in my portal. I have no clue. There's like an easy form, and then there's like a long form, and I don't know which one, like all of the different, it's complex. Give us a call here at Kingdom One. If we could help you, we would love to help you. In fact, a lot of what you even need help with might not be more than a 10, 15-minute call, as we just are able to kind of guide you through some of that quickly. And so we would love to be helpful to you. This shouldn't be something that's keeping you up at night. And if it is, please reach out to us, and we'd love to just get you unstuck in what you're working on and get that application process submitted. And hopefully, Lord willing, converted into a grant.
One other thing to add, we didn't hit over $2 million. So if you're over $2 million and you're listening to this, again, awesome. But at the same time, you're working on the loan necessity questionnaire. Like I mentioned, SBA is delayed on a lot of that. I don't know of any one entity that's had it forgiven, that's had that loan necessity questionnaire completed. Be as you complete that form, be cognizant of what you're communicating. Give as much information as necessary. I would say this is one of those points that if you're describing and going through those questions and describing the position you were in looking down the road at the beginning of the pandemic, be explicit. Hey, we were concerned about attendance. We were concerned about camp, even be able to hold camp, go the distance, give them a big narrative, an explicit narrative of the stressors that maybe you guys were looking at the onset of the loan, even if you didn't need it. I would be surprised if you didn't, to some extent, but there were a lot of organizations that applied for these things that may have not needed it, but they didn't know that at the time because there were a lot of things we didn't know. So be extra communicative in that necessity questionnaire to show that uncertainty of your economic condition. So that's one of those areas where you don't want to hold back. And again, I work with your bank on that one. That's again on the over $2 million loans. Hopefully, you have access to a CPA or in that space that can help you with that as well. It's not an easy questionnaire, but it's not the hardest thing either. But it is kind of one way to look at it is that's the SBA doing their due diligence to make sure that they're forgiving loans that for people that legitimately needed it, not like I think it was like Roos Chris that got way too many loans and ended up having to give them back. So that's kind of they're doing their due diligence, which is good. I'm glad they are. They're trying to protect the taxpayer, and thank goodness, because those are our tax dollars as well.
Yeah.
But if you're in that situation, those are a few other things to think about.
That's great. That is awesome to hear. So much detail around how we can, think about PPP and the loan forgiveness. And so quick question for you, John, how can people get in touch with you if they have any questions around this process or even around, nonprofit finance? How can people get in touch with you?
The best way is probably email. John Hughes, CPA, JOHNHUGHES, CPA @gmail.com. Can also I have a website that's just the same, johnhughescpa.com. Has a comment section. You can go ahead and you can hit me up there. A little bit about what I do on the side here to help ministries and want to get, help support the kingdom. So best way to get a hold, and I'll hopefully respond back pretty quickly.
Awesome. That is fantastic. And guys, if you're listening and you just need help with your church, whether that's in HR, whether that's, marketing or even online, you can always go to kingdom1.co/resources and download some free resources today to help you get some quick wins under your belt. Stephen, I want to kind of end with this. Is there any thoughts or anything that you would want to communicate to a church leader for this 2021 year? What would you have to say to them?
Yeah, I really enjoy any financial conversation. I start with our board at the local church I work at, HDC, or even with our church family, and often even with our senior leadership. I always like to open with a verse. It's one of my favorite ones. It's Psalm 24, verse 1. And it basically says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and all who dwell in it," right? And so I want to remind you that God is sovereign, right? And so even though we talk through a lot of financial stratagem and all the different, components of what it takes to be fiscally wise, but at the same time have faith, right? And not kind of succumb to fear. Let's just remember that that God is king, right? And so in all that, we are his kids. We get the benefit of coming to his throne whenever we want. Really we should do it often to say, Abba, Father, would you provide? Would you sustain us? And so, for you, church leader, if you're feeling today like, man, I'm worn out and I'm not quite sure how to wrap my mind around this whole financial picture, just remember the earth is the Lord's, right?
Yeah.
Including your church. And so, so that's first and foremost. The second thing I would say is this was a time, especially, and I've said this in probably every, podcast or video or whatever that I'm able to do with Kingdom One. This is the time for community. This is not the time to try to figure things out on your own and sit inside your four walls and just try to do it, and try to gut it out. And this is a time to be the church, right? And so we need to be the body of Christ. We need to be coming together to say, how can I help you? If you know something, how can you help someone else? And so, you've heard John and I talk a lot about relationship, how it's important for me as a finance person at my church to have a good relationship with the pastors, with the leadership, with the board. How even externally, how can we be a good witness to these bankers that are exhausted, that are having to do something they've never done before, and they've got all these
Mhm.
people that are cranky with them? Where's my money? When does this become my money? Right. So how can we be the church to them? How can we represent Christ to them? Right. And so, but then even back to us, how do we recognize that, man, I don't even know the pastor down the street at the church that I drive by on my way to my church every single day? Like, how can I build a bridge to them and check in and see how they're doing? Like, do you need any help? Are you working on your stuff? I'm working on my stuff. Let's compare notes, that kind of thing. And so here at Kingdom One, man, we are championing how can we grow the church together. How can we, even as now getting to do this vocationally, how can we come alongside and support you? But at the end of the day, really, the church should be rising up together. How can we all be, again, creating that community where we can lean on one another for things like this? Get me through my PPP application, help me think through budgeting, help me where you guys at in terms of how your church is doing attendance wise. How can I be praying for you? Those types of things, church leader, I would really challenge you to lean into in 2021. And man, I think the more we do that, gosh, I don't know. It seems like that is the momentum that will carry us forward and carry the church forward to actually, to be growing and to be ministering to our communities.
One thing we say here at Kingdom One is we love to become fast friends, and I think that's something that's very, very true for the ministries that we help and the ministries that we get to bless. And so if you're listening to this podcast, I want to say thank you and just know that you are a fast friend to us. We appreciate you listening, and if you guys have any questions for us, make sure to check out kingdom1.co/resources to get your resources today and stay in touch. Until the next podcast, have a great one.